When in Padmaloka last year, I saw people bowing and prostrating to each other. Quite a shock. After getting used to this, I saw that it was more like a mutual greeting. That is, the prostration or bow was acknowledged with a slight bow in return. During the puja on Saturday night, I saw that you reacted in a different way. You seemed to ignore the prostration, but once the person had finished and walked off, you suddenly did seem interested in the person and followed him, walking away with your eyes. At first, when I saw you ignoring the prostration, I thought it insulting. Having thought about this for a while, I realize I don't really understand prostration, even though I experience it as a deep positive practice. Can you say something about prostration and what it means to acknowledge it or ignore, double inverted commas, it? But first of all, something about the, well, I was going to say something about the prostration, but perhaps first of all I should say, well, there's really just a difference of degree between the bow and the prostration. We're really basically talking about the same thing, whether you just incline the head or whether you make a full-length prostration or whatever. But what about this ignoring? Here, of course, I'm following Buddhist custom and tradition, which is that if someone salutes you in a shrine where the Buddha image is present, you don't return it, because the salutation or prostration really belongs to the Buddha. If people feel like saluting you, okay, you let them, but you don't return it, suggesting thereby that you deflect it, to the Buddha, because whatever there may be in you, on account of which people salute you or prostrate or whatever, it comes from the Buddha. It doesn't come from yourself. It's due ultimately to the Buddha, to whom we all go for refuge. So it isn't the tradition, whether it's in the course of a puja or just on some other occasion. If you happen to be in the temple or the shrine in the presence of a Buddha image and someone salutes you, you don't return it. But that's rather different, of course, from what the question that speaks about before, when you return someone's salutation. I suppose, strictly speaking, and I'm not saying that people should follow this particular custom, but strictly speaking, I suppose, well, in a sense, shouldn't return it, on the basis of the custom or tradition that I've mentioned. But I mean, just leaving that aside, well, sometimes people do, like to just salute somebody, as when, say, someone is newly ordained or made a mitra, and he returns that. It's a sort of mutual acknowledgement of common commitment, you could say. So that's a rather different thing. You could say there's the prostration, say, which you offer to the Buddha or to a teacher, and there's the salutation which you offer to someone who is more or less on the same level as you within the spiritual community, and which is returned. You have, of course, to just exercise tact here. If in some situation outside the spiritual community someone salutes you, well, usually you'll return it, because, well, they may think that you don't return it for some negative reason. One has to use one's common sense. But both prostration and salutation are traditionally regarded as quite positive and skillful practices. You may remember there's an episode of this kind, or illustrating this point, in the Sutra of Wailang, where a monk appears in front of the sixth patriarch and doesn't perform I'm not sure if he doesn't perform the customary salutation, or he curtails them, he abbreviates them, and of course the patriarch takes him up on this, and he is made to realize that he's studied the scriptures as him up unnecessarily and that he doesn't really know anything at all. So yes, and I think the sixth patriarch does make this point. He said the purpose of ceremony is to curb egotism. But I think he must be using the Chinese word li, which means ritual, ceremony, formal observance, including things like bowing and prostration. And you find in the Buddhist cultures of the East, in I think practically all of them, a great importance is attached to bowing and saluting and even prostration. It can, of course, become a little formalized, but that shouldn't blind us to the fact that it is very beneficial. But of course, people in the West don't find it very easy, to adjust themselves to this. It's more a question of inner attitude. But if there's a real inner attitude of, as it were, humility, well, it should find some outward expression. But it's also connected with this general question of reverence. What would be the German word for reverence? Not faith, not devotion, reverence. And I think reverence is rather lacking in modern times. And obviously it's possible to misplace your reverence, and it's possible for your reverence to be exploited even. But that doesn't mean that reverence is not a positive mental state and that it should not be cultivated. There's a little incident, or a little anecdote I sometimes relate in this connection. I had an Englishman staying with me once in Kalimpong at the Vihara who did become a Buddhist, and he didn't like pujas, and he didn't like what he called all this bowing and scraping. He's very much against it. So I explained things to him in much the same way that I'm explaining now. But he wasn't at all convinced, so I just left it. So some weeks later, I was sitting quietly in my study, and he burst in and he said, "Bhante, I've done it." So I said, "Well, what? Done what?" He said, "I went into the shrine," and he said, "I bowed to the Buddha." And he said, "I feel so pleased." He said, "I feel much better after that." He was a very well brought up Englishman.